Hello again, everybody. This is the Williamsville Wellness podcast, and today we're going to focus in on something that Stephen and I do here at Williamsville Wellness a lot. It's called ACA. ACA stands for Adult Children of Alcoholics. These days, they've added dysfunction, so Adult Children of Alcoholics and Dysfunction. What is it, Stephen, that you think is so important about what ACA brings out for people?
Yeah, so much. I mean, I tell you this often. It's kind of one of my favorite things that I get to do here. I think that ACA provides like a different angle for people to talk about things that are very closely related to addiction. And I think a lot of people in early recovery and even with sustained recovery often will find themselves wondering that big question, why am I the way I am? Why do I do the things that I do? Why do I see the world the way that I do? Why do I find myself, doing similar patterns in relationships? An ACA group, I don't think, just doesn't on its own give people those answers, but it's a space where I think when people talk about parts of their childhood, their family dysfunction, and what they grew up with, I think they often then begin to start to get a little bit of insight and answers into those things. So I find that people who really invest in the work usually benefit from it and really like that angle of it. But also I think it's just another thing too is, for folks who have maybe been trying to get into recovery or have really been at this for a long time, and maybe even have their own kind of personal history of doing 12-step or other recovery groups for a while, something new sometimes is really helpful. It gives them something different to talk about, and it can kind of reignite their energy and passion for things too.
Yeah, I personally had about 6 years clean when I'll call it discovered the ACA materials. And wow, did that open up a lot for me, because there were so many things that had happened, when I was a kid that I did bring into future relationships, not even realizing it, But like you were saying, the patterns, I kept having these same cycles and patterns happening. And when you look at what ACA calls the laundry list, it makes it very clear what is going on. It's very clear. Were you afraid of authority figures? That whole idea. If you grow up in a family of dysfunction, there's a good chance that you walked on eggshells as a kid. That you hid as a kid. You were afraid of the adults. The adults didn't realize that even though they thought they were maybe just living a normal life and doing their thing around children, adults are much larger than kids, right? And so if you have somebody that even has a loud voice, even if they're not a screamer, that can be super scary for a little bitty kid.
Sure.
And so you develop these ways, that fear of conflict. So people that are watching, how might this affect you? So if you grew up in a house like that, then let's say, you're working a job and you made a mistake. You didn't type something in the computer or whatever, and the boss wants to speak with you. You're actually not only feeling, oh my gosh, I made a mistake and I have to talk to the boss. You're also feeling the feelings that little kid felt when they were in big trouble. And the more we learn about that, the more we can really kind of work with it and give ourselves grace, and also the understanding that we don't have to do that today. Now we're grown-ups too.
Exactly. Yeah. And that's I think often when we talk about like what does recovery mean in the context of ACA, that's a big part of it. I think it's about emotionally sort of developing, growing up, matching a chronological age, and learning to tend to the patterns that we learned, because like most things in life, there are things that we're going to have to kind of continuously unlearn and continuously practice how to manage. I mean, all the stuff that you shared there on the fear of authority figures, I think we talked about before we started, it's like we could do a whole podcast just talking about that. And that's just grade one. That's just grade one on ridiculous.
Right.
The laundry list itself is a list, just for folks who are listening, is a list of 14 different traits that the founder of ACA developed because in his early meetings basically said, among people who grew up with addiction, dysfunction in the family household, these are 14 different traits that we often find are common traits among adults who grew up in those homes. Wrote them down into a list. And it's sort of a core text or function of ACA groups. A lot of ACA groups will start by actually reading the portions of the laundry list, or maybe reading it themselves. And then, folks get a chance who are at the group to share about traits that they relate to, experiences they've had in their childhood, like you just shared, that have kind of contributed to how is it developed. And more often than not, and certainly I think this is my experience with you running the groups here, you'll find that people pretty naturally will start sharing about how, if I'm afraid of authority figures and I'm talking about how that showed up in my life, I'm probably going to start to make connections about how that played in with my addiction too. So a common one that I'll hear when we talk about trait 1 in our groups is I have this fear of authority figures, but also a really strong fear of conflict. And so because conflict in my household growing up was yelling, screaming, sometimes like physical violence, my template for what conflict means is that it's going to be 0 to 100. And so anytime someone's upset at me, I feel or even see a moment of tension, I want to withdraw. I want to get out of Dodge. I want to leave the house. I want to isolate in my room. I need to go anywhere where I don't want to be around that. And what are things that often people want to do when they want to escape? Addictive behaviors.
Right.
So, and it connects right back in. And so people, I think, who are considering, hey, is ACA something that like really applies to me, or could it be beneficial to me? I find that the connections to from the laundry list traits to addictive behaviors are pretty natural. People find them pretty quickly.
I don't like using absolute words like never.
Sure.
However, I can tell you that in session with people who have addictions, I really don't think I've ever pulled up the laundry list and gone over it with someone where they didn't relate to at least half of it.
Yeah.
Because they grew up in the dysfunction. And you're right. All kinds of light bulbs go off when they start seeing how these patterns have affected their life up to this point. And I always tell people, just like we do in the groups, the goal of reading something like the laundry list and looking at your past and how you grew up with your parents or other family members or whatever is not about blaming them for everything. It's not even saying that they were, terrible, bad people. You're basically just going on a fact-finding mission. This is what the situation was at that time, and these are the results from that.
Sure.
And so then it's up to me as an adult to change those patterns, even though deep down, my tendency is to run.
Sure.
I have to stand my ground and face whatever it is. And like I told you in groups too, when I was growing up, whenever there was conflict in relationships, especially, watching the adults in romantic relationships, that always meant we fight and it's over. Everybody takes their stuff and leaves. It's done. And that really played a role in any romantic relationship that I had, all the way until I was in my early 30s. It just did. It gave me a lot of fear and anxiety around having a conflict. So sometimes I wouldn't even bring things up because the kid inside of me believes you bring it up and it's over.
Sure. And sometimes people, I find, will balk or like hesitate at that language of like the kid inside me or the inner child. For whatever reason, I don't know, sometimes people just don't like that language. But I'll tell people that like really what we're describing when we're saying like the kid inside me is the emotions that you felt at that age, at that time, are essentially the same emotions and emotional state that are getting triggered at that point in but something similar happens now in the present. And one of the things that I think probably let me fall into ACA is that like it's really cool if you actually poke around ACA's website, which is I think adultchildren.org. They even have sections talking about how ACA connects with even more recent trauma research, actually. And they said, hey, actually, all this trauma research that's coming out that shows how stuff that we go through in our childhood can get stuck and stays with us. They're like, yeah, this stuff supports what we've been saying all along.
Yeah.
And they'll even say, ACA doesn't endorse any one particular, type of therapy, but they're very pro members who go to ACA groups. They recommend that people get into counseling individually, and they say they look for an ACA-informed counselor, someone who understands family dysfunction, who incorporates that into how they think about and how they work with people. And so I also think that that's just a really helpful piece that we can kind of bring to people who are here at Williamsville. Something you said earlier about it was kind of related to not wanting to blame the family. And it is something that I also really love about ACA, because I think that the work of ACA kind of really gets at the heart of like a really difficult task of recovery, which is like, we don't want to blame, be angry at, or resentful of every negative thing that's ever happened to us in our life. People don't really want to stay stuck in that, and that's not going to be healthy in the long run. But we also don't want to go all the way over to the other side and say, because I don't want to blame them, I'm going to pretend like nothing ever happened. And I'm ever going to talk about it, and I'm going to deny it. And so the recovery work, I think, really requires people, and this is easy in concept, I think it's hard in practice, to find some middle ground to say, how do I really take a hard, honest look at what did I experience, find the facts, and still tend to the emotional impacts that are within me without necessarily zoom in all the way to the other end of resentment and blame, where I get so fixated on this person or people in my life who did these things to me. I read something interesting that from someone who had been at ACA for a long time, and said that with enough work, they felt like their mother, who was very abusive towards them, was no longer the villain in their story, but I started to see her as just the villain in her own story, and someone who needed to do her own work.
And, to that point, one of the things that worked for me was doing a timeline and going back to when I was a baby, 1971, and looking at the ages of my parents at that time. And they were young people, and so as some of these things that happen in my life, I just follow the timeline. When I'm 5, one of them's 24 and the other's 28 or whatever it was. And I think to myself about, my 20s and how hard it was for me to kind of get my balance and different things. And so it allowed me to give them more grace. And so it was less about blaming, because ultimately when you get stuck, especially if you're in active addiction, you get stuck in that blaming cycle. It doesn't mean all the stuff that happened, is it real, but the blaming piece can become an excuse.
Yes, absolutely.
To continue to use, drink, gamble. Yeah, it can.
100%. And I think people who do really well with these groups here will often say something to that effect. That's what I think is really speaking to what I was saying. It's the hard work of it, because trying to step away from the blame and looking at what is our own accountability and how we may be continuing these patterns that admittedly they were handed to us, and we did develop them because of what we went through. But now I'm an adult, and maybe even that person in my life is long gone. And so I'm the one who really has the control and the accountability. And sometimes it's hard to hear that, because I think that people can assume that taking accountability for actions, it somehow means that like it wasn't wrong what I went through. And that's not what we're saying at all. But it's hard work. It's hard work to find that accountability, acknowledgement, balance line. But like I say, I was telling a counselor here the other day that the people who are here who, I see walking that line of what is my responsibility, what am I accountable for, and really acknowledging the emotions of that impacted me for what I went through. People who find that balance here, I think, really are the ones that you can see as working the steps. You can see them doing well in the program.
And this can be a hard realization for people, but there's another layer. Well, there's lots of layers, but this other wrinkle that can happen when you're doing the work. So, for instance, I have an addiction. I'm now in recovery from addiction. I'm doing the work of ACA, I see how, what my parents and family brought to my life and how I perceived it and what I did with it. Oftentimes when we're doing, say, a group or just talking with people about ACA, the person who is coming out of addiction, as they're looking at their past, will also realize, hey, wait a second. This stuff applies to my children.
Yeah.
And that can be a very scary thing. Sure. And so, but a good thing, it lets you know, hey, you can actually pass this down, and maybe you have been passing it down. Or, so that can often give people even more motivation to work on themselves, and then also they do the work of not bringing that into their current family anymore.
Yeah, it's one of the stuff that I think makes this kind of work so meaningful. Like, really, truly, I mean, some of the most emotional moments I've seen from people I've worked with have been people who have made that realization, but from a place of like, I don't want to do this. I don't want to do this to my kids. I want to try to be different than what I went through. And it can be tremendously motivating. And what really, I think for some people, a real spiritual experience as well. But yeah, I think that ACA does have a lot of layers. Again, you think about this stuff in lots of dimensions, and it's very simple. Like, and there's not a huge amount of reading material or text from ACA, but the more that people revisit this stuff, I find it's something that brings a huge amount of discovery into their life. Their story, their addiction, their relationships. So the more people revisit it, there's always something new to learn, which I just think I find personally fascinating, but I think can be really invigorating to people who want to work it.
And to your point on the literature, that's where actually going to the ACA group means so much, because that opens up the literature.
Yeah.
That also gives individuals a chance to share life experience.
Yeah.
And there is my personal experience with this is, when you hear someone else who has a similar situation in their life, that can be very refreshing.
Huge.
It's a warm feeling. It helps you know that, wow, all of this stuff that I've been stuck with inside my own head, someone else has too. And now we're in this group and we're sharing it together. And then the burden becomes, cut in half at that point.
Yeah.
Whatever.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. That's one of those things that I think even like up here, people know intellectually, yeah, it's good to talk about things. The experience of really doing that is something that it is sort of timeless in how powerful it can really be. I think if there are any people who are listening to this that are wondering, hey, does this stuff apply to me, or would I benefit from it? Certainly I would say if you are someone who grew up with any kind of addiction in your household, this stuff probably would apply to you in some way. Dysfunction's a broad word, but some examples that we'll sometimes give to people in groups will be like, if there was any kind of trauma, abuse, neglect in your household growing up, even things like single parent households, like due to death, incarceration, divorce, hyper controlling, sometimes they're even called militaristic homes, or like hypercritical homes can have a little bit of that impact. There's probably other things that I'm leaving off the list, but those are some other examples. But basically, I would encourage people to say, hey, if you just have ever wondered, hey, I've sometimes thought like my childhood was a little bit different than other people's, or maybe I find myself reacting in adulthood in sort of strange ways that seems out of the ordinary, it might be worth just taking a look at some of the material, or at least the laundry list, which you can find really easily online, and just read through it. And people usually will resonate with it pretty quickly if they relate to it. And then from there, I would say I'd encourage people to go to a meeting to try it out. There's tons that are available online. Depending on where you live, you can maybe find an in-person one. They have meeting locators through like their official website. But the people who I've worked with who have actually gone out of their way to actually go to one of the meetings, not one of the groups that we run here, I only have ever heard positive things. There was a person from a while ago who I worked with
who went out of their way to try an online meeting while they were here. And this was just a random meeting somewhere in the US, not anywhere close to here. And they said within 7 minutes or something like that, they had felt like they really felt understood by everyone else in this group. And it was very impactful for them. So yeah, couldn't agree more. I think that people really should check it out.
Oh, and make the time for it.
Yeah.
You know, that's is so often, especially these days, everybody talks about how busy they are and they have so much going on. If you're going to do this work, it has to be important to you. So it's something, you know, we want to set a place on our calendar to actually do it, and not get bogged down in the day-to-day. Because what ends up happening, you know, when you do this kind of work and you go to this type of group, you actually feel so refreshed by that all of the other busyness you have going on in your life is, you know, you get a benefit there as well.
Totally.
Because you're getting better.
Exactly. Sometimes people view meetings or recovery work as work because it takes time, but it's interesting that, you know, like we don't necessarily view taking the time to eat a meal as work, right? It's just something you do. But oftentimes people will find that they do these things and really engage with them. You know, they do help in a kind of way. So I would say that, like, in also one other kind of thing to people who might be listening and are considering this is, you know, we just started talking about trait 1 laundry list. And we certainly could, and maybe we will do a little bit, you know, of a deeper dive on some of the actual traits. But don't feel like you need to, like, go into these groups having a complete understanding of what you went through, how it impacted you, how it connects exactly to these laundry lists. You don't need to know that. In fact, all you really need to do is just show up and be prepared to just think about and share about how, like, what connects with you, what sounds like you, and maybe some experiences that you went through in your life. If you can just be vulnerable like that, you'll find that the discovery process is going to happen in its own time.
Oh, yeah. It's like peeling back an onion, a little at a time, little at a time. So, as you mentioned, we do have thoughts on continuing the ACA topic. So this is just going to be one of many. You know, there are 14 traits of the laundry list, and there's even something called the other laundry list.
We get to that.
Yeah, and we didn't even, because we really don't have any time left to get to that. But if you're interested in ACA and you feel like you really got something out of this podcast, keep checking back because we're going to keep doing it.
Totally agree.
All right. Thank you, Stephen. And thank all of you for listening.